All right, let's talk about chapter 15. This focuses more on DNA technology, what we might call genetic engineering. Um, and it starts out with something that's been going on for a long time. People have been doing genetic engineering a long time, but in a low-tech sense, effectively through what we call selective breeding or artificial selection. This is in opposition to natural selection. Natural selection is where things evolve out there in nature and just they change due to the changes in the environment and such. But with artificial selection, that's when people manipulate a particular species and select for particular traits that they find desirable and essentially control who mates with whom. Um, so essentially, this is how the different dog breeds came about. Because as you may know, dogs their ancestor is wolves, and so many thousands of years ago, probably tens of thousands of years ago, people started um, manipulating certain wolves that they were able to get a hold of, capture, whatever, and slowly over time, we ended up with this wide variety of dog breeds we have that are selected for particular traits, um, and apparently to be angry, according to this guy, he doesn't look particularly happy. Um, And this has been done widely in plants in agriculture. So, for example, corn is derived from a type of grass from the Mexico, Southwest United States called teosinte, which has these seeds on it, not very many as you can see, but over time and selective breeding, people have now created this plant, corn, which is a type of grass, that produces an abundance of large seeds. And of course, it is a major food source for many people around the world. Another example um, is in this group of plants. Some of them you'll recognize, I'm sure: broccoli, kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, also kohlrabi. They are all derived from the same wild mustard plant, but again, through many years and generations of selective breeding, um, subpopulations of this mustard plant have been taken in different directions, and as you can see, favoring different parts. So, of course, with kale, we eat the leaves, and so the plant mostly just produces a bunch of leaves. Um, with broccoli and cauliflower, the flower buds are what you eat, and so it produces this large, dense cluster of flower buds, and you essentially eat it before the flowers open. If they start to open, it's not good anymore. Brussels sprouts, the lateral buds. So what you're eating are little tiny bunches of leaves that are developing off the stem of the plant. Um, Cabbage, you're eating the leaves as well, but it forms this dense mass of leaves as opposed to kale, where they're not quite as densely packed together. And with kohlrabi, it's the stem, this part right here, that becomes sort of short but enlarged, and that's the part you eat. So essentially, people selected for different traits, which led to these different plants. Um, so a common thing that's done is what's called, when you're doing breeding, whether it's plants or animals, is hybridization. And this is what Mendel did with his pea plants when he crossed his purple flowered plants with his white flowered plants. He was creating hybrids, and you may recall that we described these groups of plants that had the purple flowers and the white flowers as being true breeding. That is, they were homozygous for that trait. That is, when you bred purples together, you always got purple. When you bred whites, you always got whites. But when you cross such groups of individuals, that's called hybridization. And hybridization often creates, of course, it creates unique combinations of genes and unique individuals that have often desirable traits. Um, and the book mentions this person, Luther Burbank. So I got a picture up here of him. He was a very prolific plant breeder in the 1800s, and I think he's credited with creating over 800 different types of varieties of plants. And one of his most famous is the russet Burbank potato, which is the most common potato grown and has his name attached to it. We typically think of it as russet, but it's really known as the russet Burbank potato. And it's what the vast majority of McDonald's French fries are made of. He also bred this one, the Shasta Daisy, as well as many others. So he just spent a lot of time crossbreeding plants, creating a lot of hybrids. And when you do that, you often get a number of individuals that really don't show desirable traits, but you'll get those few that have the right combination of genes that give them very desirable traits, and those are the ones you save and you sort of mate them amongst themselves to create what you might call a hybrid that now becomes a true breeding line that shows particular traits. Um, so when you see different um, types of cows, the black and white ones that are the dairy cows, they're a particular variety or hybrid that is good at producing milk to drink. And then you have Herefords, which are the brown and white ones, which are beef cattles, or the black ones, the Angus, which are beef cattles. So again, those are all different varieties or breeds, just like with dogs. And it's all through selective breeding that they've come about. Now, once you create a desirable breed, you sort of just mate them amongst themselves. So you do inbreeding at that point. Um, so with plants, um, this is really easy, in particular because many plants are hermaphrodites. They're both male and female. They have male and female parts. So you can just mate within a plant. You can cross between the flowers within a plant, and that's a form of inbreeding. And that will retain those traits that you want. Now, in animals, it's a little more difficult because inbreeding, obviously, an animal can't mate with itself because they're either male or female. Um, and you want to try to avoid mating between individuals that are too closely related, brothers and sisters and first cousins. But again, to maintain these breeds, you have to do inbreeding. And that does have some undesirable side effects, as you may be aware. Certain breeds are known for having certain problems because they are essentially inbred. Really large dogs like Great Danes and such, they tend to have problems with their bone structure and their hips. I believe it's bulldogs have problems with because their snout is so sort of pressed in with their nose and their eyes. So it's nice to have those particular traits that a breed retains, but again, there are sometimes some undesirable side effects. Now, with enough inbreeding, you can sort of reduce or breed out those undesirable traits, but it's hard to get rid of them completely. Um, Now, let's say you want to increase the variation. Um, well, what can you do? Of course, the natural source of variation are mutations, and mutations do occur naturally, but it's possible to sort of speed the process up, if you will. And you can essentially induce mutations, and so radiation is a good way to do this. Now, you might think radiation, that's terrible. And we generally would not do this to, say, an animal, because that would probably be considered somewhat unethical. But in plants, it's not really a big deal, or bacteria for that matter. You expose them to radiation and induce mutations and see what comes out of it. Often it's not such a good outcome, but every once in a while you do get a favorable mutation arising, and then you can attempt to retain that mutation. Um, Now with plants, and in particular with animals, what we'll do is we'll often search in wild populations for some of these new alleles, these unique genes. And what we'll attempt to do is breed them in to our population. Um, so, for example, with potatoes there's wild potatoes, and they're native to South America, the Andes mountain region. And so what you'll do with, say, your typical russet Burbank potato is, so it's a particular combination of genes. It's just retained and used year after year. Well, what happens is the pathogens that are out there are evolving, whereas your potato, you're just keeping it the same year after year, and so that can put it at a disadvantage to these pathogens. So what you'll do is attempt to retain the basic genetic structure of your potato, for example, that with all the good qualities you like, but you'll attempt to use those wild populations as sources of genes that can give them your potatoes some variety to resist these pathogens. And so there's a lot of effort these days to retain these wild populations and these unique varieties as a source of new genes, new alleles um, for breeding programs. All right, something that is seen in plants, and I think we've talked about this a little previously, is it's called polyploidy, and this is when, so normally we think of organisms, animals in particular, being diploid. That is, you have two copies of each chromosome, but in plants, it's not that unusual to have more than two copies or to be polyploid. That is, to be triploid, tetraploid, hexaploid, octoploid, for example. Um, and you can see ploidy levels tend to stay even numbers, and there's a reason for that, because when you have an odd number of chromosomes, those individuals are sterile, because when they form gametes, the number of chromosomes those gametes have is kind of funky, and when you try to put those two gametes together, you often get embryos that don't have the right number of chromosomes, and it just kind of messes things up. So they tend to be even, because the even ones are sterile or are not sterile and can reproduce. And so there are naturally occurring polyploids, but there are, as the book mentions, certain chemicals that you can expose plant embryos to that will induce and increase the number of chromosomes. And so there are a lot of artificially induced polyploids um, that are out there. Not on here is the strawberry, which is an octoploid. And it was sort of accidentally done by people when two different wild species were kept in a common garden, and they crossed, which created a polyploid, which is now the domesticated strawberry that we have. Um, all right. All right, that's it for section 15.1. We'll do 15.2 in a separate video.